U.S. President Donald Trump has repeatedly labeled April 2nd Liberation Day. But what exactly does he want to liberate the U.S. from? On February 13th, Donald Trump issued a memo called the Fair and Reciprocal Plan, designed to reduce U.S. trade deficits in goods. He says the calibrated tariffs he will roll out starting April 2nd will target other countries' trade barriers and free the U.S. from its reliance on foreign goods. A trade deficit occurs when a country like the U.S. spends more on foreign goods compared to what it earns selling its own products. Now, Trump believes that trade gap has ballooned over the years as trade partners take advantage of the United States. During his first term, the trade deficit averaged around $600 billion US. Fast forward to 2024, that has ballooned to a record $1.2 trillion for the whole year. Now, part of Mr. Trump's goal for putting up trade barriers is to shrink that wide trillion-dollar gulf between U.S. imports and exports by getting foreign nationals to buy more American goods. From December 2024 to January this year, the monthly trade deficit surged 34% to an all-time high of $131.4 billion US. That is the largest jump since 2015.
Now, when the Trump administration unveils its new tariff measures, some trade partners will be feeling a lot of pain than others. The White House is set to be focusing on applying the reciprocal tariffs on countries with persistent trade imbalances with the U.S. And based on 2024 data, now these are the nations with the biggest goods trade deficit with the U.S. All right, so looking ahead, let's speak now with Pushan Dutt, Professor of Economics and Political Science at INSEAD. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. So we've been hearing at times, Trump and his officials framing these reciprocal tariffs as a way to reduce trade deficit, make U.S. rich. Other times, they say it's to protect U.S. workers and industry. I mean, what do you think is his strategy and primary goal behind these tariffs?
So if you look historically at what Trump has been saying, one of his core beliefs are that tariffs are the magical solution to just about everything. So that's a position he's held consistently. Now, what he's trying to do is actually to start getting production, especially manufacturing production, back into the U.S. He's also laser-like focused on the goods deficit, ignoring sort of the services deficit, the services trade, because the U.S. is actually a big exporter of services. Now, there is a lot riding on this term reciprocal, like reciprocal on what? As you showed, for instance, the trade imbalances between the U.S. and its trading partners. The reciprocal tariffs are also about tariffs, like looking at what a country charges the U.S. and how much the U.S. charges them. This is a gargantuan, undertaking if he's going to try and equalize this, because, there are 196 countries in the world. There are about 7,000 lines, as they are called, in terms of trade just in goods. And, that would mean something like 3 million tariff lines are being negotiated. So it's going to take a bit of time. It's also not clear, whether they will do it on a country-by-country, good-by-good basis, or they will, just classify countries into a red category, an orange category, and a green category.
Right.
So there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and I'm not sure where these things will end up.
Well, Professor Dutt, what's your call, though? Is he going to be taking a reciprocal approach, the difficulties of which you just outlined, or do you think it possibly might be universal? And there's also the question of whether or not it's going to be phased, or whether it's going to be all out?
So I think it's going to be phased. It has to be, because, as I said, it's a massive undertaking. So, I would say that this is going to happen over a period of 2 to 3 months. Keep in mind that this time the tariffs are coming in much faster than before compared to the first Trump administration. So in the first Trump administration, the tariffs are narrower. They were sort of on only a subset of countries. This time they're broader because, he's got this set of countries that are called the Dirty 15. These are some of the countries that he showed there. And these are the ones that he's actually going to be targeting. So it's actually, even though he's been saying that it's going to be, on a country-by-country basis, because trade has become so complicated and goods cross borders so many times, this is essentially going to broaden, and it's going to shrink world trade. And that's going to really hurt countries like Singapore, which are, heavily dependent on world trade.
Professor Dutt, I mean, there is a lot at stake, $3.3 trillion in terms of total U.S. imports. I'm wondering how you think America's trading partners are going to react, first of all, to what's at stake there, but also, isn't it true that many governments around the world need to protect certain sectors, like agriculture and food, but also manufacturing, because it's just simply a matter of their political survival? And I mean, how are they going to, I suppose, get around these difficulties?
So I think right now we are seeing there are about three models out there in terms of how countries are reacting. Okay, one is the Mexican model, which is just to stay quiet and acquiesce and try to cut deals. Then there is the Canadian, European Union, Chinese model. And these are like large countries in the sense they are very large trading partners. So they are threatening retaliatory tariffs. Okay, so that's the one where we see the all-out trade war. And the third one are relatively smaller countries like Australia. So what Australia did was that they protested very strongly against the tariffs against them, but they did not impose tariffs on their own. Because these tariffs tend to hurt consumers just by raising prices, and they hurt producers because suddenly the cost of things that you import and then use in your final good production, that actually goes up, and that gives you a cost disadvantage. So again, amongst the large countries, I think a big trade war, and not a direct impact on smaller countries like Singapore, but I think a big indirect impact, especially since many of the things that these countries make now cross border multiple times. So that's going to lead to a lot of, uncertainty and a lot of disruption because of these tariffs.
Professor, President Trump says that tariffs will make the U.S. rich. And in fact, trade advisor Peter Navarro estimating the U.S. would raise about $600 to $700 billion a year from tariffs. I want to get your thoughts on that. What do you think about the projection? Or do you think the risks outweigh the potential gains?
So Trump is, administering shock therapy to the U.S. economy and to the world as a whole, because the U.S. is the largest importer in the world, so it impacts all countries. But neither the world nor the U.S. asked for either shock or therapy. And you can see that reflected in the markets. So the calculation, there are lots of contradictions in this policy. So, for instance, saying that we will raise a lot of revenues, and therefore give tax cuts. We'll raise tariff revenues, but at the same time, we want all these companies to actually relocate in the U.S. Well, if they relocate in the U.S., then they're not going to be paying tariffs. So in that case, it doesn't raise tariff revenues. Sometimes you say that this is about negotiations, and if they get concessions on some extra trade issues, things like fentanyl or immigration, then the tariffs go away. But then again, you sort of don't get the tariff revenues. The biggest problem, of course, is that imports, even though the number, like 300 billion, 1 trillion sounds big, it is far, far less than the income base, which is about $20 trillion in the U.S. economy. So the only way to raise that much revenue is virtually impossible, because if you put tariffs too high, then imports go to zero, and as a result, your tariff revenues also go to zero.
Right. Professor Dutt, you mentioned Australia and Singapore, two countries which have FTAs with the United States. I'm wondering what you see happening to these FTAs. Is the Trump administration going to rewrite all 20 of them? Because it does enjoy a surplus with Australia and Singapore at this time.
Yeah, so the FTAs, especially the one in Singapore, which, actually bounds tariff rates, there are some complications out there. At zero means that Singapore and Australia are actually not vulnerable to these reciprocal tariffs. Whether you just look at the trade imbalance or whether you look at the tariff differences. But I think these countries should also focus on what happened with NAFTA, and currently called the USMCA. So NAFTA is one of the oldest free trade arrangement between Mexico, Canada, and the US. So during his first administration, he renegotiated that, and he said that he came up with the USMCA, the Trump administration, and they said that that was an improvement. But then he proceeded to actually violate the USMCA, which he himself had negotiated. So that, I think, is sort of the key vulnerability, that these FTAs get renegotiated. Will he do it with Singapore? I don't think so, because Singapore is actually, too small a country to come under the sights of the US, whereas Mexico a lot of manufacturing jobs in the US actually went to Mexico, or they were scattered around these complex supply chains between US, Canada, and Mexico. So I think on that front, Australia, Singapore, which have not taken a lot of manufacturing jobs, they are not vulnerable. But if he broadens the trade war away from tariffs to things like investment incentives, like tax policy, which Singapore provides at, trying to get, let's say, the electronic semiconductor sector back, then that will actually have a big impact on Singapore.
All right, understood, Professor. We'll have to end the conversation for now. We have been speaking with Pushan Dutt, Professor of Economics and Political Science at INSEAD.